My friends, welcome to 1789 Massachusetts. I am Corey Shockey. I have the great good fortune to lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at the American Enterprise Institute. And because we are an institution whose organizing principles are defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place, it is an especial privilege today to be able to host these four great advocates. I wasn't counting the captain of our ship, Dalibor. I apologize for that. These four great advocates of those principles. Ambassador Courtney has been ambassador to, Georgia, Belarus maybe, Kazakhstan, and he's also been the special assistant to the president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. He is also co-chair of the America 2025 effort, which is maybe a subject for another day.
America
250. Thank you.
Anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
It's something that Yuval Levin and our Social and Constitutional Studies program here has an enormous interest in. George Kondelaki is with Sovlab, an effort in Georgia to help understand the totalitarian history in order to open up the space for policy discussions about the future. He's been a member of Georgia's parliament. He has been the head of Georgia's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and is a great force for good. And also Congressman Mike Turner, friend of this institution, former mayor of Dayton, Ohio, member of Congress since 2002, chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as now on the Oversight Committee, and a longtime member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and a great advocate for the transition to freedom and prosperity of states that did not have that luxury, especially not since 1945. And this discussion is captained by AEI's own terrific head of European policy, Dalibor Rohac. Dalibor, over to you, my friend.
Corey, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody, and warm welcome to everybody who's watching the live stream remotely. I'd like to start by saying how delighted I am to be hosting an event on Georgia here at AEI. Georgia is a country that is very close to my heart, as I suspect it is to the hearts of many of the attendees and participants here. However, obviously, I would like to be hosting this event under somewhat less febrile and less uncertain circumstances. If there are two main drivers of this uncertainty that I'm talking about, it is first and foremost the topic of our discussion today, the upcoming parliamentary election, which does feel like a make or break existential moment for the country, one that will really determine Georgia's geopolitical anchoring and level of freedoms enjoyed by Georgians and the quality of government enjoyed by Georgians for a generation, if not more. But if there is another source of uncertainty, it's the one that we will probably not touch on explicitly in the conversation yet, which will still cast a shadow over our conversation, namely the election coming up here in the United States. Again, I don't know who the next president is going to be or what the next administration's Georgia policy will be, but I think it's fair to say that Georgia, the country, was not a top issue in this year's presidential campaign. More worryingly still, with the election season in full swing here, the concern, which is not unreasonable, is that given the level of political division, the United States may be quite distracted in the coming weeks and may not be on top of its game, especially if we are faced with unexpected sources of instability in a place like Georgia. So if there is a sort of happy note to all this, it is that I'm joined on the stage by a truly stellar panel of experts, policymakers, people who've been deeply involved in Georgia, and I want to really highlight the presence of Chairman Turners, who is taking a break from, I suppose, his campaigning and from his time when Congress is not in session, to come here and talk to us. My understanding is that Congress will not reconvene until November 12th, so we really appreciate your willingness to sort of engage and discuss this important topic with us. The way I imagine organizing this panel is that we'll start by having a conversation between the four of us, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. In the interest of time and in the interest of preventing endless monologuing or disruption, what we'd like to do is to invite our participants to submit their questions online using either the hashtag #AEIGeorgia on Twitter or by emailing it to my colleague Catherine Camberg at the email address provided. So you can already start asking your questions now, and I'll get them on this little contraption next to me. Congressman, I want to start with you, if I may. Again, thank you so much for joining us. But I want to ask you a very basic question. So you clearly have been working a great deal on national security. You chair the Intelligence Committee. You're a friend of Georgia. You've been to the country many times, oftentimes on bipartisan congressional delegations. But you're also a member of the House from Ohio's 10th District. You go home a lot. I imagine you talk with your constituents. What would you tell somebody in Dayton, Ohio, who would ask you, about Georgia and why you're seemingly so obsessed with Georgia? Why does Georgia matter to the United States?
Well, this really does go to, as you described it, this is the issue of freedom, democracy, and independence. And it really does go back to our expectation of when you visualize in your mind the fall of the Berlin Wall. We look at that as a moment in history where authoritarianism was crumbling and democracy was marching across Europe, and countries were gaining freedom and independence. We made a mistake then, and our mistake was that we believed that Russia, the Soviet Union, had changed. But the mistake we made is that the Soviet Union did not take down the Berlin Wall. They merely didn't shoot the people that were doing so. What occurred was the crumbling of the Soviet Union as the crumbling of that wall. And the people that were self-declaring democracy and independence that was flowing across Europe and all the way to Georgia had to be both fought for and declared. Even though it was not accomplished by actual wars, it still had to be supported and nurtured. And you still see today that the struggle is occurring, and that's what you still see today in Georgia, and you have to be concerned about, because we could so easily lose it. As we look at the actual war that is happening in Ukraine, and the meeting that occurred between President Xi and Putin in Russia, where they stood together, where President Xi made the point of going to Putin in Russia while that war raged. He stood beside him and he said, in what we would call an open mic, a hot mic moment, right? Where they were just talking with each other, but the world got to hear it. He said, what we're bringing about change that hasn't happened in 100 years. We, the two of them together, and we know what that 100 years is. That 100 years is World War I and World War II, and that's the fight between authoritarianism and democracy. And that's really the fight in Georgia. Now, Georgi and I have known each other. We were just talking for over a decade. And I have a great deal of respect for him because he's certainly been in that, standing in that gap of making certain that Georgia makes that transition and permanently to democracy and freedom. And that's really where the United States needs to stand. And that's why it's so important. And that's why the people, I think, in Ohio, although we're all turned during the election cycle to what's happening in the state of Georgia, the reality is the freedom of all of our freedoms are based upon each other's freedoms, and those are going to be determined in part by what's happening in Georgia.
So you brought up Xi in Moscow, and obviously Xi is in Moscow again, together with other BRICS leaders and together with the Secretary General of the United Nations. Are you concerned that the validation that the UN Secretary General sort of provides to the Russian regime by being there can open a Pandora's box, provide the permission structure for Georgia. Let's put it frankly, for Georgia's governing party that is talking quite openly about entrenching itself in power and maybe trying all sorts of shenanigans after the election.
I think our focus has to be on what's going to occur this Saturday and what's going to occur after that. The United States has to be very clear that if there's a new direction in the leadership in Georgia, the United States is going to stand in support of that direction, and that we're going to support fair and free elections, and certainly we're very much aware that we want a strong relationship with a populace that clearly identifies themselves as pro-West.
Georgi, can you give us a sense of what is happening in Georgia right now? So we are barely 4 days away from the election. What are your expectations? What opinion polling tells you? What are your predictions and kind of the best and worst case scenarios that you are sort of working with?
Thank you, Dalibor, for hosting this event, and thank you, Congressman, Ambassador, for focusing on Georgia and when elections are taking place in the U.S. Well, I think there has been the changes in the air in Georgia, both in the context of atmosphere, but also a lot of credible polling also indicates that it is more likely than ever that Georgia may go through the second change of government through democratic election. Now, the big question is whether the party in power, which has displayed alarming signs of definitive drift towards the Russian orbit, will accept that. And I think it's very important for various scenarios to be considered in this city. Also, while, of course, the U.S. establishment is focused on U.S. elections, obviously, as you mentioned and as Congressman mentioned, Georgian election matters. To the United States, it's not just another election in a faraway country where democracy may break down, and democracies have broken down in different historical cycles. Georgia matters to the United States because for a number of reasons. We have decades of important alliance relationship that cannot be just relinquished, so to speak. So Georgia is also, the bad case scenario means that Russia may score a major geopolitical victory in Georgia. That is a bad case scenario, which should also be considered. Now, that would be a calamity for the Georgian people, which, as it was mentioned, and as Congressman mentioned, remains resolutely pro-US and pro-Western, but that I also believe would be a blow to US interests. And so while there has been, let's say, fatigue with Georgian politics for understandable reasons in Washington, the geopolitical angle of what's going on there must not be forgotten. And finally, for the future, if things go the right way and Georgia is insulated from some of these instabilities by the virtue of NATO membership and closer alliance, but just by the virtue of geography, just look at the map. If there was a direct highway, there would be a 5-hour drive to Iran. And because of regional peculiarities, also, there cannot be a better ally for the United States in that region other than Georgia, which, of course, has a committed democratic government and is part of the community of Western nations.
Ambassador, you served as ambassador to Georgia in the 1990s, and I was very young back then, but my sense, looking back at that era, is that this was a period when Georgia kind of seemed stuck politically and policy-wise, and then a few years later, it sort of surprised the entire world by making this enormous progress with economic reforms, kind of its reorientation towards the West, this massive coalescing of civil society. So we really have a sort of a huge variation in kind of policy outcomes and sort of political moments in Georgia's relatively short contemporary history. So when you look at this current election that's coming up, how is the current situation similar and different to moments we've experienced, either in Georgia or in other parts of the so-called post-Soviet world that you sort of worked with and interacted with, and how well prepared are we in the United States and in the Western world for what may soon come?
So throughout the former Soviet space, when governments are in power too long, they may start more reformist, such as Putin, and then go backward. That happened to Shevardnadze, it happened to Saakashvili, and it's now happened to Georgian Dream. So the real problem is governments, the lack of alternation in power, which is so essential for a democracy. What's different about this election is that never in the past, over 3 decades of Georgia's independence, has there been a government that's been so hostile to the West, that's taken such an anti-democratic and more pro-Russian, let's say, less friendly to the West direction than this government has done. It wasn't that many years ago that we thought Georgia and Ukraine were both on parallel paths to come into European Union and make democratic reforms. Ukraine has maintained its democracy despite the stress of a war. Georgia, on the other hand, without such a stress, has turned in a different direction. So for us in the West, we're going to have to take a look at the election, see how it goes. We've had a past pattern of uneven responses to cheating on elections. So for example, in Belarus in 2020, we imposed light sanctions. Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan have had crooked elections, no sanctions. But in the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, in which Yanukovych was elected in the first 2 rounds of voting that were considered to be not free and fair, Secretary of State Colin Powell said that the U.S. did not regard those elections as legitimate. Well, are we going to see in the elections now on October 26th, are we going to see a Western reaction more akin to the ones to Belarus, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, or more akin to the Orange Revolution? A lot of that depends on the Georgians themselves, depends on how much cheating was there. Do the people go into the streets as they did in the Orange Revolution to reject it? It'll depend on what Europe does, because Europe is really more important than we are, because Georgians want to be part of Europe, not part of the United States. So we'll take a look at all those factors.
I suppose one unstated assumption in Georgi's earlier remarks was that if you sort of look at the state of public opinion in Georgia and the sort of power of different political blocs, a united opposition should be well on track to be able to form a new government after the election. Obviously, whether that happens or not kind of hinges on whether there is a peaceful, calm, normal transfer of power after the election. If I may turn to you, Chairman Turner, actually, with a twofold question on this, because I was watching these images over the weekend from Tbilisi with all these people with EU flags singing Ode to Joy, and it was greatly uplifting and moving. But at the same time, it sort of brought to me PTSD from 2014 in Kiev, when you had Ukrainians fighting and dying for European values, for lack of better term, and then Russia responding, snapping with the annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass. Now, without revealing any classified intelligence that you might have access to, what do you think the Russians might have in store in response to a decisive victory by the opposition, a pro-Western turn of Georgia?
I mean, publicly, it's obviously that they're, not only do they have a great interest, but they're obviously attempting to influence, and they're there. And by the way, the ambassador has a great product from RAND in June, I think, of this year, setting out of Georgia the history. That is a great read if people want additional information. I was just in Georgia with Senator Shaheen in August, and we were there for the purposes of doing a bipartisan, bicameral trip to state, we're there for fair and free elections and for a strong U.S. Relationship, and looking to the government for what do they see as their responsibility, what could they do to help rekindle that relationship. And we were kind of taken aback. The Prime Minister had nothing to add as to what he saw that could be contributed to a better relationship. So I think there really is a headwind that is different than what the populace is seeing. And again, this is not about sphere of influence. I mean, we're not looking at Georgia as we want it in the West's influence or the US's influence, as Russia sees it or as China sees it. We want freedom and independence, and people to be able to have that which they can seek by joining the West and by joining NATO. Russia's and China's goals are that people, as they've made clear, be in that authoritarian sphere, and that, of course, is contrary to the people seeking their own independence.
So on that note, what would you propose to your colleagues in Congress and to the administration, which by that point might be a sort of lame duck administration, to do if Georgian Dream and or Russians try to pull off all sorts of shenanigans to entrench Georgian Dream in power, despite the wishes of the Georgian people? What is it that you would like, those Georgian Dream potentates to think about right now as they are contemplating their options?
Well, first of all, I think that it's important for the United States government to pay attention right now. When this election happens Saturday, if there should be a change, the United States should make it clear that a smooth transition to power needs to occur, and the United States will be paying attention, and that we will be active. Right now, Russia's a little busy, and so busy that they're looking for other people to try to help them with just what they're trying to accomplish in their own sphere. They don't have the ability to throw out a whole bunch of other activities. In this, if this is the free, fair elections and the outcome of the goals and objectives of the Georgian people, the United States and the EU and our NATO allies need to stand behind them and support that open and fair transition. If we are silent and we are not active, we could see it fall into chaos or something that benefits those, including Russia, who would want to subvert it.
Georgi, I see you're sporting your Slava Ukraini pin, and I commend you for that. And one of the things that you see everywhere in Tbilisi are Ukrainian flags. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how what is happening in Ukraine is connected to what might happen in Georgia this coming Saturday, and perhaps to sort of broaden the question even further, what are the parallels and differences between the referendum and the election that we just saw in Moldova this past weekend, and the massive interference from the side of Russia and the sort of phenomena that you observe in Georgia these days?
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with Moldova. The paradigm there is the opposite of Georgia in the sense that in Moldova you have a pro-Western government and Russian interference to destabilize it. In Georgia you have the opposite. You have government that is now, most people agree, it's rather undisputed, that is displaying very strong signs of being pro-Russian, to say the least, and you have Russian efforts to back it. And if you don't believe what I say, you can just check the 3 public statements of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service in the last couple of months, the most recent being a personal statement by its chief, Mr. Naryshkin, saying that we, I quote, meaning the Foreign Intelligence Service, want to support Georgia to prevent a US-backed revolution, which should be read that the Russian Federation and Georgian Dream are jointly working on various contingency scenarios. Now on Ukraine, and that also should be given proper attention in Washington. It's a very serious thing. And I think it's very important to cool down in the context of the upcoming days. It's very important to try to cool down certain hotheads in both Moscow and most importantly in Tbilisi. On Ukraine, I think the behavior of Georgian government on the Ukrainian question, right since 2014, has been one, not the only, but one key symptom of the gradual slide of Georgia towards the Kremlin orbit. And the gravity of this symptom has not been fully appreciated. Let me put it this way. In short, as it stands, and ever since the full-fledged invasion started in 2022, Mr. Ivanishvili, the oligarch who runs the Georgian government, he bets on Russia's success. And we can, and there are many multiplicity of symptoms to make that conclusion. So I think, of course, it's important for the West and for the United States to double down on supporting Ukraine and for the Ukraine to prevail, but also for the future, Georgia and Ukraine should be part of the package in the context of the next enlargement of the free world. That both Ukraine and Georgia, I think and their peoples have sacrificed enough to demonstrate the solidity of their commitment to be part of that space of nations. I mean, this year, not to go on for too long, this year marks 100th anniversary since the centennial since 1924 anti-Soviet uprising in Georgia. And while there was neither European Union or NATO existed 100 years ago, the consensus of the Georgian society to be part of that space of Western nations where there is rule of law and civil rights and so forth, that consensus was what drove that uprising.
So assuming that consensus prevails in some meaningful sense this weekend, and yet the Georgian Dream will still try to steer the country towards Russia. Ambassador, what would you advise, if you were in the position to advise Secretary Blinken, what would you tell him to do in response? What are the sort of menu of policy options that you think the administration should deploy, given the time constraints and the sort of political situation on this side of the Atlantic? And do you expect them to behave roughly, in alignment with the advice you would have provided?
So Chairman Turner is correct that we should react quickly to that election. There should not be long delay. The factors that will describe what we do in part depend much on Europe. Again, as I mentioned, it will depend in part on areas where we do have some cooperation with Georgia on counterterrorism, law enforcement, and stemming the flow of illicit military technology to Russia. But other factors such as the hostile relationship and the anti-democratic turn. So there are complex of factors that will affect how Europe and the United States react, but it's important that that reaction be soon and that it be pretty forthright. And I don't think anybody in the West expects a free and fair election, certainly based on the administrative measures that Transparency International outlined. They're off to a bad start. And then Mr. Ivanishvili has said that after the elections, in which he seems to assume that a constitutional majority will be obtained, which probably can only be obtained through large-scale theft, he said that the opposition will be eliminated at any cost, and he's called for Georgian Nuremberg trials of the opposition. That's pretty scary. I mean, we haven't seen Lukashenko talk like that.
It is pretty scary. I mean, there was also rhetoric coming from the same political party calling for basically abolishing the currently existing opposition parties. Now, your answer mentioned the sort of imperative of acting quickly and Europe in one sentence. And there is a degree of tension between those two things, at least in my mind. So when you go back to the most recent Belarusian election that was stolen, it took the EU over a month to roll out its package of sanctions against the Lukashenko regime, because I think Cyprus was holding it up because of some unrelated dispute with Turkey. So do you have the confidence that the EU will do better this time?
Yes. The Europeans have been pretty strong in what they've said. The EU ambassador and the US ambassador in Tbilisi say pretty much the same thing. There's a lot of anger. I think there is some buyer's remorse in the European Union that accession was granted to Georgia despite the current government's attitude.
Candidate status.
Candidate status. So we're probably likely to see the US and the European Union and Great Britain all move fairly quickly and pretty much together.
Chairman Turner, you sort of alluded to what seems to be a sort of bipartisan consensus in this town on the importance of having Georgians exercise the freedom to choose their government, choose their geopolitical alignment, and have a government that they sort of democratically choose. Yet, I mean, there are a few areas of strong bipartisan consensus in American politics these days. And on foreign policy in particular, there seems to be a kind of divergence between voices like yours, I suppose, that would sort of align with some form of sort of core values-based sort of beliefs of this sort, and people who, including in the GOP, who would say that in the world that we inhabit, the United States doesn't have the same degree of sort of freedom of action, and therefore we have to prioritize certain regions of the world at the expense of others. That everything that we do has to be driven by our overriding concern about China's rise and containing that rise of China, and that perhaps remote little countries such as Georgia, Moldova, just have to be put on the back burner for a while. Do you agree with that view? And where does Georgia fit into your understanding of the China challenge that the United States faces?
Well, first off, yes, of course I disagree. On a number of levels, one of which, of course, is the premise that this is not a small little corner of the world. This is a very important one, and China, it doesn't have great vast reach beyond ours. It's not as if we have to say we have to limit ourselves as they have a vaster reach. In fact, I think we have the better we have the better marketing in that people understand that this is about their freedom, their independence. China's attempts to export both their surveillance society to other authoritarian regimes and to pull together authoritarian regimes. People understand that shtick. This is about losing rights. This is not about independence and self-determination. The thing is that we just have to stay committed to it. So many times we waffle and we fail to go to the end game of what's necessary to deliver. And I think in part, Georgia has spoken, I think, very passionately of the waning at times of U.S. policy. Where are we? I think we just have to be consistent, and we have to be active, and we have to be at the table. And this is one where this is a turning point for Georgia, and so that it's that much more important that we be there and we be committed. When it comes to issues where, especially where where authoritarian regimes have been and have contracted, and democracy and freedom have broken out and are trying to still take hold, there is no greater voice in the world than ours.
Georgi, in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the EU has taken the unprecedented step, both in its sort of reach and its speed, to grant candidacy status to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Obviously, Georgia's accession talks have been suspended because of the behavior of the Georgian Dream government. But my intuitive sense is that for the EU accession process to do its magic in Georgia the way it did in Central and Eastern Europe decade and a half earlier, or 2 decades earlier, it has to go hand in hand with tangible security guarantees, with the sort of framework of security for these countries. Yet you have Russian tanks, Russian troops on your territory, as does Moldova, as does Ukraine. And taking a sort of longer-term perspective, it seems fanciful to think that anything else than NATO membership for these 3 countries can provide a durable security framework for this part of the world. How likely is it that Georgia will be a NATO member in our lifetimes?
Well, thank you for this question. I tried to imply that already in my previous intervention. of course, NATO membership, and Georgia had, by the way, a referendum on this question in 2008, in January 2008. Yes, 20% of Georgia is occupied, but there are ways to secure membership for Georgia even before the occupation. I think the way the Georgian government, the fact that Georgian government has de facto relinquished the NATO membership as a policy priority in itself had been one of the overlooked symptoms of Georgia's foreign policy erosion. But I think it is without doubt that NATO membership is something for the new government, if and when the democratic change happens, to bring it back on the table. And I'm sure now, with the increased and shifted geopolitical awareness in key Western capitals, including in capitals of nations that were very skeptical in 2008 at the Bucharest summit and so forth, modalities can be found which would secure significant progress and ultimately the membership for Georgia in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is something that the overwhelming majority of the Georgian people back, and which, again, as I already said, would be a win-win for both Georgia and the United States and its power projection in our region.
Chairman Turner, I was just wondering whether you had your own take on Georgia's eventual NATO accession.
In Bucharest, NATO made the statement that both Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO, and that was a very forward-leaning statement. And the intention, of course, is a statement by NATO that both nations, in aspiring to have membership, are welcome in NATO. Obviously, the issues that Georgia are facing currently are not external; they're internal, and as those are resolved, their candidacy, their eligibility for NATO, then too will be resolved. I do believe that freedom wins. I think it's a difficult and messy process through the democratic process, but I think that as long as we're willing to stand with Georgia, that democracy will win, and as it does, I think that Georgia is going to be an excellent candidate, an excellent member in NATO. Wonderful.
So now it's time to open it up for your questions. Again, you can submit your questions by email to my colleague Catherine.Camberg@aei.org or on Twitter, or platform formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag AEI_Georgia. We have our first question from the wonderful Laura Kelly from The Hill. And I'm going to read it to you, and I'll ask whoever on the panel would like to grapple with it. Like Georgia, Moldova is trying to break free from Russian influence in its desire to move more closely towards the EU, away from Moscow. Much of the narratives in Georgia against EU integration played out during Moldova's election, where the EU referendum passed by a margin of 13,600 votes, largely from the diaspora votes from Europe. What does this result say about the challenge facing the US and Europe to aid democracies to combat Russian interference, where the battle is not over yet, with Moldova's presidential runoff on November the 3rd, and in Georgia, where the Georgian Dream stands a good chance of actually succeeding in these elections? Should we go from the far right?
Okay, sure. So Moldova, unlike Georgia, for example, has had a substantial communist influence in the period of independence. So this has been tougher for Moldova in some ways than Georgia. Georgia's been more unified. Over 80% of Georgians want to take a pro-European path. So the shift in Moldova has been a bit more recent, and as we see in this election, it's a closer call. So it's going to take time to see how Moldova evolves, but being on the border of European Union members is probably going to have a strong influence on Georgia's future. On Moldova's future.
Yeah, I think it reminds, since Moldova has pro-Western government and still the Russian interference has been able to make that significant impact. It reminds us of the risks for the Georgian elections and the impact Russian interference can make when you have the government that is essentially pro-Russian today. But it also reminds us of the importance for the U.S. to draw lessons from the past and to draw lessons from the gradual drift of Georgia towards the Russian orbit in the last few years. Or in other words, that not exercising legitimate leverages to halt that process or reverse this process, which is what Georgian people want, has been probably not the best policy, or doing nothing sometimes is not the wisest policy, because when Georgian Dream government crossed one red line after another in the context of enabling Russian influence, the fact that the political guidance from the Georgian file more or less disappeared in Washington has turned out to be, unfortunately, an enabler for the growth of Russian influence. And Georgia has been brought to the brink, or the Russian influence has reached the extent in Georgia which was unimaginable, and it's really a serious blow to the investment that both Georgian people and the United States have made in this relationship over the decades.
Chairman, if you'd like to weigh in.
My advice would be take the win, and the West needs to work both with Moldova and Georgia on win the future.
Wonderful. Georgi, you touched on this a little bit when you mentioned Georgia's proximity to Iran, but I wonder if you could sort of expand a little bit on what it is about Georgia's geography more broadly that makes it an important asset for the United States and the Western alliance more broadly, whether it's in the context of our competition with China, whether it's in the context of our concerns about the Middle East and Iran's role. If you could sort of highlight the sort of three most important bullet points about why Georgia truly matters, even in the sort of crudest, narrowest, sort of realist sense of the term.
All right. Let's consider both bad case and good case scenarios. In a bad case scenario, if Russia scores a major geopolitical victory in Georgia, that's, as I said, a calamity for the Georgian people, but it's a serious blow to Western and U.S. interests in that region. By definition, in such case, the Armenian project or the efforts of the Armenian government and the society to gravitate towards the Western space, this whole project would be closed because Armenia would be isolated. In a good case scenario, of course, if you have a committed, democratically elected, committed democratic government in Georgia, and Georgia is being brought into the Western institutions, then of course, by the virtue of geography, but also regional political peculiarities, by definition, the United States cannot have a more committed and reliable ally in that part of the world than Georgia. And I think, again, that scenario would be a win-win for both Georgia and the United States and NATO alliance.
So I saw Corey's hand up, and because Corey is my boss, and because I'm generally, eager to please people, I'm like a Labrador retriever in that sense. I'm going to break the rule that I myself instituted and let her ask her question in person, with or without the mic.
Thank you. When performance reviews come around, this will be remembered. So I want to underscore a really important point that Chairman Turner made, which is that Russia is stretched, trying to hold its own against the Ukrainian military in their incursion in Ukraine. Now is the time to stress Russia's other commitments, Russia's other aggressions, because we are likelier to have the means to be able to affect positive change in those places because Russia is at its bandwidth with what they already have undertaken. My question is for you, Georgi, which is, as we see the increasing convergence between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, given the geographic location of Georgia, do you see any consequences of that, either manifesting themselves already or in potential security concerns for Georgia?
Yes, that's a very important question. One of the symptoms of this erosion of Georgia has been the alignment with political alignment with China. The Georgian government signed what they call a strategic partnership charter with the Chinese government, which embraces not only pillars of economic cooperation, but also political pillars of the political foreign policy platform of the Chinese Communist Party. It's quite amusing that in the Georgian media, Georgian political discourse, when they issue press releases or whatever, they refer to the Chinese Communist Party as the ruling party of China, as if there are other parties, and there will be elections, and then other parties may win. That's quite amusing. The ruling party in China has a name, and it's communist. And that has been an important symptom of Georgia's gradual drift away from what the consecutive Georgian governments have built so relentlessly. So yes, that has, and that's one of the reasons why we are here today, is to stress the geopolitical dimension of this whole dynamic that has come to the surface, has become undeniable, undisputed in the last few months, this year, but the dynamic that has been there for the last few years, I would argue even since Georgian Dream came to power in 2012, and there have been these symptoms there, but unfortunately what I call bureaucratization of the Georgian file in Washington, and for various reasons, legitimate reasons, evaporation or the thinning of the political guidance of the Georgian file in Washington has enabled this drift, so to speak. The bureaucracy has acted without much political guidance, and it turned out to be an enabler of the Russian influence in Georgia, with the U.S. being 2 or 3 steps behind the reality on the ground in this particular context.
I mean, this term bureaucratization of the Georgian file, I think, is very important because there is a obvious parallel between what you're describing and the EU's long-standing approach to the enlargement process as it played out, especially in the Western Balkans, where you had countries that were nominally promised accession talks and progress towards future membership without really much of a political commitment on the side of the existing EU member states to deliver on that front. Then the whole affair was sort of left in the hands of the European Commission, which, for all its efforts, couldn't really make things happen. And I think in both contexts, political leadership is important. I think sort of selling this to including to your constituents back in Dayton, I think is so crucial to,
right. And
to make
so
a change
the
happen.
Dayton Peace Accords, for example, were in my community. So it's interesting you mentioned the Balkans. So you got to watch both U.S. policy and the EU policy shift from a mentorship program to as you were saying, this oversight program of someone with a clipboard and waiting for boxes to be checkmarked, instead of how do I help you and how do I nurture and how do I build democratic institutions, to just as inspectors looking, have you done it yet? Which we can't be dispassionate and disconnected and be the champions of democracy and expect on its own that it's going to be able to be achieved.
So I have a question from John Soliday, and I'll address it to the ambassador. Is trade policy a lever that the collective West, the EU, United States, can use in its interactions with Georgia? If so, how?
Trade policy is something that's particularly important for European Union, because most of the trade, for example, that comes out of Georgian ports really goes in the Black Sea, Mediterranean Sea, to ports in Europe or North Africa or something. Very little of it goes to the United States. Often in the past, some Georgians have said, well, it would be helpful if Georgia and the U.S. negotiated a free trade agreement. Well, in the abstract, that's yes, but the U.S. Special Trade Representative has priorities that typically involve countries that trade a lot more with the United States. So we just have to keep in perspective the relative roles. For example, the Middle Corridor, as it's called. Middle Corridor has a lot of economic implications for Europe, has a lot less for the United States. So we and the Europeans can act in parallel, complementary ways, but we do have somewhat different interests and capabilities in that region.
Still on the trade note, Chairman, if I may ask you, Georgia is among those countries that have played a role in in helping Russia get around the existing sanctions regime. So you look at it, so trade statistics, exports from various European countries to Georgia, orders of magnitude larger than before the full-scale invasion. You've done these trips to Georgia, including with Senator Shaheen. How do Georgians, including the current government, respond when you bring up this concern? And have you seen it really? Have you really seen them sort of engage it in a sort of good faith, constructive fashion?
Well, obviously we raised it, but it was in a context of a number of things, including the upcoming election itself. On the issue of trade, I think the ambassador gave it a great characterization because they are sort of in a different neighborhood than us, and I think Europe really does have a greater leadership in that regard.
Georgi, I have a question from Ben Scheffner at the National Endowment for Democracy on the operating environment on the ground for opposition candidates and activists. So, we saw the Russian-style foreign agents law enacted. So, what does it mean in practice to, be an opposition or candidate or activist in Georgia these days? I mean, how free and unobstructed is the campaigning? How violent things get? Have you yourself felt physically threatened at any point? Just give us a sense of the texture on the ground, if you will.
Thanks. To make it clear, I'm not running for Parliament this time. But yes, it's quite an exceptional campaign by the world standards, because, I mean, how many campaigns can you recall in which the election promise of government is to ban opposition? It's just amazing. Of course, what overshadows this campaign, amongst others, is this campaign of violence, the state-organized violence this spring when we had demonstrations against the Russian-backed and inspired foreign agent law, when you had violence not only at the demonstrations, and there too has been no effective investigation, but also tracking down opposition or civil society leaders outside their home and just beating them up. And that has been something that has significantly poisoned the campaign, in addition to the pressure and intimidation and the abuse of the administrative resource, as the ambassador has already mentioned, with all of that in package. So this violence, I mean, we know that there are these groups of wrestlers and state-organized thugs that were already employed, and this is a significant thing, and it's very good that the United States government sanctioned several Georgian police officers for orchestrating this campaign of violence. But I think, and it played a positive role in cooling down some enthusiasm for that. But again, the exercising of legitimate U.S. influence through imposing sanctions on some of these troublemakers and people who push Russian influence remains something that is still very effective and actually impacts the situation on the ground.
So I'll ask the ambassador one question from Omer Niazi.
And by the way, I'm sorry, just a few days ago, a colleague of mine in the Soviet Past Research Laboratory, which is the think tank I work for, was just walking down the street. We just signed a memorandum with political parties to open Soviet-era archives, which are closed in Georgia, to do illustration and things like that. And on that day, I don't know whether there's a connection or not, but on that day, a researcher of our think tank was beaten by Georgian Dream related people just in the street, and no one has been arrested, as an example of whether these things are around me.
So one final question, and I'll address it to the ambassador and to Chairman Turner. It is from Omer Niazi from the Kennedy School, who suggests that recent developments between Armenia and Azerbaijan have opened the door for negotiations, and if reached, an agreement could reduce Russian influence in both countries. What would the implication of this be for Georgia? Do you see Russia intensifying its effort to control Georgia, or the opposite?
A lot will depend on what kind of arrangement is worked out, if the arrangement is worked out. Now, let's remember the Armenians now are in the process of expelling a number of Russians. The Azerbaijanis, in their war with Armenia, they relied mainly on Turkey. They didn't rely on Russia so much. So we shouldn't automatically assume Russia's going to get a lot of influence in that region. But to the extent that there is more peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that should be helpful over the long term for Georgia.
Congressman,
Right,
any
in
final
time,
thoughts?
yes, regional conflicts, of course, in that region do benefit Russia because they utilize it, of course. The one thing that we've seen, though, and I think that is probably the most important as we're looking at what Russia is doing with BRICS and what they're continuing to do with Ukraine, what they're doing in Georgia, what they're doing with now, we're seeing perhaps North Korean troops in Russia, perhaps being engaged in Ukraine with Iranian weapons in Russia. The Russia's aggression is not going to stop. This is not a limited engagement by Russia. This is not just a regional conflict or regional interest. This is the long sustained goals and objectives that Putin has for Russia that is currently being supported by the Russian government and the Russian people. We have got to shift our policies both toward Russia and in the region to understand that this impacts us directly, not just on the margins, but holistically. And of course, that means that it has a significant impact for us as we look to what's playing out in Georgia, and we need to make certain that we pay attention and that we're there, and what happens this Saturday is important to us as a country and in that overall Russian goals and objectives, and it affects us.
I'm afraid this is the note on which we'll have to end, and I think it's a great sort of final message to walk away with. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our three excellent panelists, Congressman, Ambassador Georgi.
Thank you.
Thank you.